Good afternoon. All right, everybody with us, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody here today, public safety meeting. Before we get started, we're going to ask Representative Crow to have a word of prayer for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let us pray. Dear Lord, thank you for allowing us to gather together here to conduct the business of the people of the state of Georgia. Thank you for the beautiful day you've given us. Please allow us to have a good deliberation on these bills and conduct ourselves in a way that would be pleasing to you. Guide us and keep us. Thank you for everything you do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Me and you keep pushing the wrong button. No. We'll get it, man. Today we have two bills. One, we're going to have a vote. The other is a hearing only. So we're going to start with SB 404. If Senator Albers will come right here at the table. Does that make you more comfortable there? All right. If you'll just tell us the bill and the LC number, we'll go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. I appreciate your time today. This is Senate Bill 404. We're working off of a committee substitute LC 33-9103S.
Everybody got that? All right. Floor is yours.
Thank you. This is a simple bill, but it means a lot to my fellow public safety friends and even folks like me who have been EMTs for a very long time. Under current law, when you become licensed as emergency services, EMT, paramedic, etc., similar to what we might do with the permits we have, you have to do a background check. So you get fingerprinted and those information gets sent off to the GBI and FBI to get a background investigation done. The challenge here is when you get recertified years later, if you don't have that, you have to go back and get re-fingerprinted and do all that again. Now, here's the good news. Fingerprints don't change. This just simply streamlines the process. So the Department of Public Health, who will have that stuff on file, will simply be able to rerun those processes, making it easier, especially in a time right now when trying to get first responders both into that line of work and staying in that line of work has been more challenging and critical than ever. So again, the bill is very simple. This is a committee substitute. I want to address that specifically, Mr. Chairman, if I could. One of my colleagues in the Senate floor came up with what we thought was a pretty good idea. However, it was inconsistent with the law in other areas and where he had wanted to have the opt-out mechanism put into the law. This is standard language throughout the law in many, many other places. And there's not a mechanism for the FBI just to be able to automatically take out and expunge that information. However, again, it's really not a concern because they are doing it for the sole purpose of running a background check on someone. So this is a good bill. It will help out our EMTs and our paramedics and my brothers and sisters in public safety. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All righty. Do we have any questions from the committee? I believe we don't at this time, Senator Albers, but we do have two people that want to speak to the bill. Ms. Rhonda Westbrook. Is she here? If you'd like to come up to the podium right here.
I apologize. They asked for us to sign in. I do not want to see your record.
All righty.
This is the GBI and they're in support of the bill.
Okay. Mr. Neil Gessenberger.
We just don't have to sign in. We were not looking.
Oh, you're good to do. Well, all righty. Is there any other further question? I'll entertain a motion if anybody's ready. I have a motion. Do I have a second? All in favor, say aye. Aye. You're good to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. All righty. Next, we'll have a hearing on Senate Bill 504. Senator Robertson, if you want to come to the podium. No, see, that'd be fine. I'm sorry. And we'll let the floor be yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm glad to follow Chairman Albers with another simple little bill. Yes, sir. I tend to do that. I apologize. I'm working off LC 280460, and that is Senate Bill 504. And what this does is it simply redefines the term bail restricted offense. a couple of the men and women out doing the job is if we just placed all felonies in Georgia under bail restricted offense. And what that means is if an individual is arrested for a felony in the state of Georgia and it is a bail restricted offense, then it means that that individual must post a bail to be released from jail. Now that bail can be $25, it can be $50, it can be $5,000, $100,000 based on the background circumstances of that individual, the type of crime they committed, and in some cases, as we've seen, some of those individuals will not receive a bail at all based on criminal history. We had a press conference here on March 15th here in the city of Atlanta where the mayor and the chief spoke about the arrest of 20 individuals. These 20 individuals, each one of them at that particular time had been arrested for at least 3 felonies each. Those 20 individuals had in their past history over 553 charges placed on them while living here in the city of Atlanta, including 114 of those charges being felonies. Of those 20 that were arrested, 7 of them were released on bond before the police officers were able to complete their reports and get them in. Of those 7 that were released prior, 5 of those individuals had been arrested for charges involving guns, convicted felons in possession of firearms. And of those 5 that were arrested for being convicted felons in possession of firearms, 3 of those individuals got out on bond before the police reports were done. What we need in the criminal justice system, and I think what this bill goes to do, is it streamlines and makes clear the individuals who can and cannot just come in, walk through that revolving door, and walk back out. A lot of individuals discuss persons being incarcerated and held in jail for misdemeanor possession of marijuana. Well, it's a misdemeanor. There's absolutely no reason why that person needs to be held. That person can be released on their signature, on their own recognizance, as they can on any misdemeanor. Our jails should not be warehouses for misdemeanors. Our jails should be the places to hold individuals who commit serious crimes against their fellow Georgians until they post bond, get out, and become a part of the criminal justice system as they wait to go to trial and experience due process. I think what moving these other few felonies, which I don't think there's as many as some folks are concerned about, under the definition of bail-restricted offense, not only does it make Georgia safer, but at the same time, it makes our criminal justice system run smoother. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the panel, from the committee? All right. Representative Hawkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
I hear you, and I think the concern that I have after reading this, and I'm a former prosecutor as well, is as it stands now, the law is pretty narrowly tailored. And so if this were to be expanded, you're going to catch a lot more individuals, and maybe that's just the intent. But what is your response to the question that, for the most part, those that can't pay bail are those who are poor? And so those who will have their liberty taken away, and I'll remind everybody that this is before a trial, this is before a conviction, this is just during the initial stages of a law enforcement action. What's your response to that in terms of that impact, which I think is real and disparate and pretty clearly demonstrated?
I think there's a legitimate concern, but I think, as you said, and as a prosecutor, I appreciate that job. It's a thankless job many times, but I think you do understand that those individuals who are arrested by law enforcement for felony charges, that arrest was made based on probable cause. This was not some out-of-the-air detainment and ultimate arrest and ultimate being placed inside of a detention center, which as we know is exactly what a county jail is. This legislation doesn't involve anybody or impact anybody in Georgia state prisons. So the judge has very wide discretion as far as what the amount of bonds are. If the individual is arrested for something and the judge feels that that individual is in one of those situations to where he or she cannot afford a large bond, then the judge has a discretion at setting that bond, you know, anywhere, like I said before, $25, $50, whatever, because we have found that individuals that have some, air quote, this skin in the game have a tendency to be more compliant and following through in the process of due process, which I know many times your investigators going out and attempting to locate individuals involved in crimes, whether they be witnesses or those charged, sometimes run into a lot of difficulty trying to locate them and get the information that needs to be done for a prosecutorial investigation prior to trial. But I think by not boxing the judges in where a bond for a particular charge has to be set at a particular amount, I think it opens up a lot of opportunities. And we have seen throughout the country during the unrest over the past several years that a lot of groups that are concerned about these types of cases of where individuals, whether they are correct or incorrect, being held in jail, we've had a lot of special interest groups and nonprofits set up funds where they could go into these detention centers and post the bonds themselves to help these individuals get back out. So I do push back on the belief that our jails are full of a lot of innocent people, because I know that not to be true. And so I think that the safety that's provided to the citizens of any municipality by there being a slight obstacle for the vast majority of the dangerous people held in our county jails to be able to get back out is worth the inconvenience that somebody may have to come up with a $25 or $50 bond.
If the issue is dangerous, then doesn't it make more sense to keep our current structure, which seems to be tied to crimes that actually have a danger component?
Well, I think any crime to a certain degree has a danger component with the amount of surrendering one's will to do right, to go out, whether it is to steal $1,000 or whether it is to burglarize a home and possibly cause injury to somebody who might be there. I think there's a certain abandon of values that occurs when that happens, and I think most crimes do create a certain level of danger. Some may be lower than others. I would agree on that. But I think the trade-off to protect our citizens, those good men and women who work every day and follow the rules, those who live in wealthy communities, those who live in the poorest of communities, I think that the weight of our attention has been drawn away from them, and I think it is time that we push the weight back toward protecting the victim of crimes and the potential victims of crimes, as stated by the mayor and the chief, where we see that we have certain components within our community that carry a large portion of the responsibility for the crimes committed. Because of the 553 crimes committed by the 20, only 114 of them were felonies. So many times misdemeanors begat felonies. And I think that is a big concern. And I'm sure you in your role as prosecutor and in my role as a law enforcement officer, many times there were conversations where we would arrest somebody for one felony and 6 misdemeanors. And through the sentencing process, once the ADA and with your approval and the Superior Court judge or whomever would come to an agreement that it would just be that one felony that they would end up being sentenced on, and the misdemeanors would tend to either go away, non-prost, or either rolled into the felony.
And with the circumstance, and I hear this too from my local communities, I think a lot of representatives do, is the issue of repeat offenders that take up a lot of the time, which is probably true in every organization on the planet. There's a certain percentage that requires a lot of attention. Is it your understanding that the reason why they continue to offend is just because of a parole issue, or is it something different?
Well, no, I think I think at some point it becomes a way of life. We've looked for many years and tried to drill down on the causes of crime, looking at poverty, looking at racism, looking at other issues to try to figure out, you know, what the secret sauce was to solve the problem. You know, President Clinton, along with, you know, Senator Joe Biden, ironically, passed one of the strongest anti-crime legislation that the United States has ever experienced back when President Clinton was in office. And what we saw was drastic drops in crime rates, but drastic increases in incarceration rates. And then I think about 6 to 8 years later, when we had labeled the results mass incarceration and we tried to go in the other direction, then we saw the opposite. We saw crime rates rise as incarceration rates fell. So I think things like this, along with other creative ideas, accountability courts and other things, along with truer sentencing guidelines, I think may get us closer to that magic sauce to try to take those within society that choose not to follow the rules and do want to prey off the others in society who choose to follow the rules. I think that until we get that perfect balance, then I think we're going to continue suffering the crime rates that we're suffering right now. And I think this Senate Bill 504 is just one piece of the puzzle to get to that solution.
Mm-hmm. I hear you, and I have the same goal in terms of public safety and reducing the overall incidents. And your point is well taken, and I think in addition to the factors that you mentioned, education. If you look at our Department of Corrections, 92% of those who are held in the Department of Corrections have a GED or a high school education or less. And so the correlation between education is there. It's not even a question mark. But with that, I want to just ask one more question if I can, which is, I'm supportive of your end goal. I just have concerns about the policy. And to try to state it as simply as I can, that concern is those that can afford it will be released, and so the public will still have a risk because they have money and can pay bail. Those who do not have money will not be released, and they will be incarcerated before they're convicted and have gone through the criminal justice system. So I have concerns with that. And the question that I'd like to close with, if I may, is what are you hearing, or what data do you have to share, and hopefully beyond just the anecdotal, with respect to individuals not showing up? Because that's the primary purpose for bail, is to make sure that people show up for their court hearings and processes and everything, in addition to the safety issue, which I think is pretty well addressed for those crimes that already exist. So I'd like to just hear what you have in terms of the scope of the problem on a broader scale.
And I'd be happy to share with all the committee members some of the hard data. But right now, the data in general is the fact that prior to the legislation from 2 years ago, we were seeing extraordinarily high rates of failure to appear, especially here in Metro Atlanta, where there was a big push away from any type of bail beyond signature or OR bonds, if you will. And in some cases, as you understand, an officer stops somebody for a misdemeanor, he or she has the discretion in many cases just to issue a citation. And so here in the metro area, we saw an extremely high number of failure to appears when they moved away from requiring any type of bond at all, or like I said, even to the extreme of just handing a citation and walking away. And you know, the problems that come along with that is, you know, you basically have more. If you were to go and get a failure to appear warrant on every one of those, you would never have enough personnel to go out and find all those individuals, especially in a city the size of Atlanta, unless that individual went out and reoffended, and while going through GCIC or some other system, you discovered them that way. So I think the opportunity for individuals to walk away and not be worried about a court date and everything is a legitimate concern. But at the same time, you know, I do want to mention, and I know it's semantics to a degree, but we just have to understand that those individuals sitting in our county jails are being detained. In you being, you know, a whole lot well versed than I am, understand that those in in our prisons are incarcerated. And so while individuals are detained, and again, in Muskogee County, when an individual came in the jail and they were charged with a felony, probably the third or fourth step in their booking in process was a financial disclosure form that was filled out by the deputy sheriff who was booking them in. And everything from how many vehicles they owned to whether they rented or owned a home and everything else went into that form. And that form, along with other information, went to the district attorney's office and to the Superior Court judges. And the judges at that time would be able to use that and determine what an individual's ability to post a bond. Now, it would not prevent the judge from assessing a bond, but it helped the judge understand at what level the bond should be assessed. And in some of the what would be considered nonviolent crimes, such as a large theft of money or a theft of a vehicle, a lot of times those bonds were set at the value of the property stolen or the amount of money that was stolen, things of that nature, so that if the individual did get out and were to abscond, there would be some kind of security there that could be used as some type of money offered to the victim to attempt to make the victim whole at some degree. And so again, and like I said, you understand the process as well as anybody. The system we have is it's a robust system, but it is very easily unbalanced with adjustments here and adjustments there. And I think all we're attempting to do here is just try to adjust it a little more back to the center, to where not only are we trying to make the community safer, but we're trying to offer a light to the victims of crimes to show that we are concerned about them as much as we are about the offender.
I hear you. I think we're closer to the center now without the expansion, but I definitely appreciate what you're saying.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Holcomb. Any other questions from the committee? Chairman Powell.
Thank you to the author. I was sitting here and I'm looking. I noticed that the current language, it spells out the bail restrictive offenses, and best I'm counting is about 27 or 28 through there. And these seem to be the more egregious, but how many other felonies would there be?
Our numbers are estimated somewhere around 20, Mr. Chairman.
20 more?
20 additional, yes, sir, that deal with things like misconduct with a child under the age of 16, forgery, obstruction of a law enforcement officer, which I believe it would be felony obstruction of a law enforcement officer, and things of those nature would come under there.
I listened to your answers to my colleague down there, and one thing I did hear that came out crystal clear, that bonds aren't set as punishment. They're set to be sure that those accused come back to court. That's the principal reason for that. And you know, you talked about what had happened in the last few years, and I know that this COVID epidemic and all has changed the whole face of how things operate. But one of the things that we do want, and I think in a civil society, is that once charges are made, those people need to show up. There needs to be a way of getting those people back to court, especially at a time that this laissez-daisical attitude that we're living under a state of an emergency or whatever, and they just flip it off. And a lot of times when these judges don't allow for bond, and I think you even said yourself, the judges have the discretion. Probably my good friend Director Scandalakis could probably answer that better. But judges have the discretion when it comes to the amount of bond that they set. I mean, you know, we've always said the only difference between God and a Georgia Superior Court judge is God knows he ain't a Georgia Superior Court judge. And, you know, to me, this just gives it a little bit more uniformity, that if somebody has been accused of a felony, then they need to show up. And, you know, and I think it's a pretty good, I think what you put out, I've had several people that came to the office to talk to me about this, and a lot of them are concerned. They tell me that a lot of the law enforcement officers or the departments would be opposed to it because they're afraid that it would just overpack their jails. But the judges have that discretion instead of just carte blanche, just dismissing a felony charge with a personal recognizance, because a felony is a very serious offense and it should be treated as such. So I'm appreciative. I'd like to hear if there's any antis out there. I'd like to hear what their arguments might be to this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to your point, our jail should not be overcrowded with misdemeanors. If an individual has committed a misdemeanor, there should be avenues for that individual to get out of jail. And there are thresholds set in many crimes that determine whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony. And so there's nothing preventing the courts from working with the sheriff's offices and others now to release misdemeanors from jail. And it would be, you know, it'd be positive, because the jails should be there to detain those individuals who have committed the most egregious crimes or been accused of committing the most egregious crimes. And based on the charge, based on the criminal history and other things, you're absolutely right. The judge could set the bond as, you know, 20, I mean, you know, if we want to get down to the silliness of it, the judge could set the bond at a penny if he or she chose to. But, you know, setting a reasonable bond. And I've always been concerned about the bond industry. The first, I think the first book I read was something titled Ransom, written by a staff member for Senator Robert Kennedy back in the late 60s. And read many publications since that time. And I agree that in years past, many years past, that bonds were used as a form of punishment. But I think we have moved way beyond that now. My concern is that we have individuals, as our friend who has been a prosecutor understands, that when individuals get out freely and understand there's a turnstile at the county jail to where they really don't have to have any skin in the game, then those individuals do evolve into the recidivists that we see today and go out there and prey on our citizens within our community because they know the criminal justice system has no teeth and that they'll be back out before the police report can be completed. And that's my fear.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from the committee? All right, we do have several folks signed up to speak to the bill. When you come up, if you'll come to the podium, what we'll do is have you introduce yourself. The first one is James Woodall and Devin Franklin. Are y'all coming together, or if y'all want to? Yeah, if you'll introduce yourself and.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the members of the committee. My name is James Woodall. I'm a policy associate at the Southern Center for Human Rights. And since 1976, we have worked to promote equality, justice, and dignity within the criminal legal system. And it is with that mission that we are in full opposition to this legislation. I'm going to first yield to my colleague, Devin Franklin, who is a former public defender, and he's going to speak about the process, and I'm going to come with a very specific language about the bill itself.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, everyone else. My name is Devin Franklin. I am currently the Movement Policy Counsel for the Southern Center for Human Rights. I assumed that position last Wednesday, March 16th. If you were to ask me what I was doing before that point in time, March 15th, I was still a public defender. And for the 12 years prior to that, I've been a public defender. More so than that, speaking, I know Mr. Robertson spoke, Senator Robinson, excuse me, spoke directly to some of the issues that have been going on in the city of Atlanta, Fulton County. I worked at the Fulton County Public Defender's Office, and I think I have really unique insight into some of the way that the policy actually works in person. In my 12 years as a public defender, I have worked exclusively with felonies. There are 25 or 28 or so currently bail-restricted felonies. There are more than 600 felonies on the books that this proposed legislation would apply to. That includes, it would expand to things such as possession of fentanyl. I think there's even something here about the receipt of cotton, a statute that was passed in the year 1900 that would be covered by this proposed legislation. I have represented upwards of 1,000 people in this county. I've tried over 40 cases to jury, and in each of the cases for the thousands of people that I've represented, I would say only a handful of persons that I have not argued bond for. And so I want to give you all a bit of insight into kind of the mechanics of actually how a bond hearing goes, not to insult anyone who actually has probably done this work already, but to make sure everyone understands it's not just a willy-nilly type of discretion that's being given to judges. There are both statutory restrictions put in place by OCGA 1761E that lay out the factors that the judges can consider in doing so. There are 4 factors. 3 of those actually contemplate dangerousness. One of them is connections and ties to the community, but more importantly, and to the point of Mr. Robertson, the others are threats, the ability of a proposed defendant to potentially threaten or intimidate witnesses. Based on their record, what is their likelihood of reoffending and their likelihood of damaging property? So all these things that are contemplated in parts of the concerns that are said to be addressed by this bill are things that are already within the discretion of the judge. And I can tell you that I've had several bad days from my point of view, where persons who I personally felt deserved bond, even a signature bond, as we call them in Fulton County, or unsecured judicial release, were denied those bonds. In assessing all the factors that are put before the court, including the facts that are part of the case and the accusation, the judge kind of has 2 decisions to first make. And the question of money is by far the secondary and the last that we consider. The judge will consider the dangerousness factors, the allegations before the court at that point in time, and then they will make a decision. Is this person worthy or unworthy to be given a bond? If they are deemed to be too dangerous, we don't even get to the point of talking about money. If they are seen as an appropriate risk for whom certain restrictions and conditions can be put in place, for instance, access to accountability courts, going ahead and getting a person who was charged with just the possession of half a gram of fentanyl or a gram of cocaine, and having the option of getting that person to treatment sooner than later. And you'll hear later on why that is an extremely important consideration. The factor that that person can be given treatment earlier on is an important one. Whether that person needs to go ahead and get involved with an organization like Partnerships Against Domestic Violence and begin getting training or counseling regarding violent behavior. These are things that can and usually are put in place. I know there was some concern about the number of FTAs, people who don't show up to court. And again, having worked in Fulton County dealing with felonies, I will say that it happens, but not to the extent that I believe that Senator Robertson is giving everyone the impression of. I will say that in my most recent years, certainly during the pandemic, the largest factor in people not showing to court is poverty. People have lost their homes because of lack of income during the pandemic. Mail is sent to their home. They never change their address. If a person is not able to pay their phone bill and I call them and say, hey, we have court tomorrow, and they're not able to pick up a phone and be reminded of court because they did not get the piece of mail, they don't know about the court date. And that is usually solved by myself filling out an investigator form and having my investigator do a search and locating that person. And I would say more times than not, over 80% of the time, myself or someone who I work with tracks down the person who missed court. They show up to court the next time we have it reset. And if they're not, a bench warrant is put out, so the next time that they are stopped for speeding or walking down the street and ID'd by an officer, the bench warrant is then in place. I want to talk a bit about kind of what else is involved in the actual hearings. Again, in my 12 years, I have conducted bond hearings at both first appearance, pre-indictment, post-indictment. I've even had occasion to file motions for reconsideration and have bond reheard when factual circumstances have changed. One, I'm not sure about the contention that police reports are not yet filed at a bond hearing so that the judge is not operating with an understanding of the facts. One, if a judge doesn't know the facts, they're looking to reset the case until they do. Second, at most first appearances hearings where I think this question about police reports is coming up, there is either an officer present or more frequently a sworn statement, which more times than not is basically a recitation of the facts that were put forth in the police report. So whether the report is filed or not, there's written documentation present at the hearing, even at first appearance, so that the other side of the case is known. I think the counsel is somewhat aware of Marcy's law in pre-indictment and post-indictment cases. Victims are given the opportunity to come and be present and speak their piece during bond hearings and other hearings. So that's an additional restriction, additional factor that judges are given to make a decision about whether a person is worthy of bond, or if they're too dangerous to do so. I have experienced with my own eyes a victim in a case come into a courtroom and say, "Judge, I know he doesn't have a bad history. I know he doesn't have this or that, but I am scared." And I've seen the judge give significant weight to the testimony of victims and go forward with denying a bond where the facts of such are appropriate for that judge to determine that these allegations, in fact, put a person in fear of being intimidated or threatened or something to that effect. So I think what the concerns that I believe the representative earlier was questioning about, I think Senate Bill 404 just goes a bit too far. I was raised by a country grandmother, and she was one for anecdotes. And there's this one kind of that compares a toenail clipper and an axe. There are certain jobs that are needed to get certain things done. If you want to chop down a tree, you probably need an axe. You don't need a toenail clipper for that. The toenail clipper will not get the job done. To the contrary, if I'm going to clip my toenails, an axe probably could get the job done, but do I really need to use an axe to cut my toenail at the risk of causing more damage than is necessary? So in a world where we have a narrowly tailored statute already, expanding it to include more than 600 of those takes away discretion from judges who have a level of experience and expertise, who are held accountable through elections, and are being given actual live facts pertaining to the incident and the person in question. And so I think that we have a system where the parties involved, the DAs who would presumably be asking for a bond or a no bond, the judge who is weighing the facts, the probation officer or pretrial officer who is giving a recommendation or a recitation of the history of the person at the hearing. There are a number of factors that are being given that ensure that an educated decision is always being made by the judge.
All right, Mr. Franklin, thank you very much. Mr. Woodall, did you have, if you can kind of keep them brief, we got several more signed up to speak to this.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I just want to wrap this up. One of our main concerns is not necessarily in this bill, but it is a part of the statute 17612 that is implicated within this legislation. And it's really the definition of what unsecured judicial release is. And in the Senate hearing, it was inquired as to whether or not pretrial diversion and access to accountability courts would be impacted by this legislation. And the answer was no, but in fact, that is incorrect because as you see in 171612, subsection B, it says, certain qualified judges, including Superior Court judges, may issue an unsecured judicial relief if such unsecured judicial release is noted on the release order and the person is not charged with a bail-restricted offense. Why is that important? Because if a person is charged with a bail-restricted offense, pre-indictment, we see oftentimes, if not almost all, well, not always, but occasionally you have persons who are granted unsecured judicial release for the purpose of entering mental health courts, drug courts, veterans courts, etc. If you are charged with a bail-restricted offense, it will become not nearly impossible, it will be very difficult for a person to access those programs and services because they are charged with a bail-restricted offense. Now, we can't say that this denies the access, but what it does is if you're not able to afford a bond determination that is made by a Superior Court judge or their qualified designee, then you will not have access to an accountability court, and that's problematic for a number of reasons. And with that, I'll stop there. I know there's others signed up to speak, but I just wanted to make that point.
No, thank you very much. Any questions from the committee? I don't see any, so we'll move on to the next. We have Sherry Boston and Jared Williams. If you will both introduce yourselves, ever how you work this out.
Thank you very much. I am Sherry Boston, and I serve as the district attorney for the Stone Mountain Judicial Circuit, also known as DeKalb. And I will also state that prior to becoming DA, I served as the Solicitor General for DeKalb County. So for the last 12 years, I have been in the position to run both the offices that deal with both misdemeanors and felonies in one of the largest metro areas. So I have a lot of expertise in these issues. And I will keep it brief before I turn it over to my colleague, DA Jared Williams. But there's just a couple of things I think it's important to note. Specifically, when we're talking about the current bill or the current law. And let me just say, there is no person in the criminal justice system that is more committed to ensuring public safety in the court system than your local district attorney. And so making sure folks that are committing violent crimes are not going to continue to be a problem for the community pending trial or securing their coming back to court are very important. But I think we also need to understand that just like all misdemeanors aren't created equal, and when I was solicitor, let's not forget, a speeding ticket is a misdemeanor, and I think we can all agree that a speeding ticket is not the same as that same misdemeanor of perhaps family violence battery when we're talking about domestic violence. The same works true for felonies. All felonies are not created equal. And what this piece of legislation would do would equate all of those felonies. The 28 that we have delineated, and to the question of the committee is how many felonies do we have? We have over 600 felonies in the criminal justice system. So you would be talking about theft by shoplifting. You would be talking about passing a bad check over a certain amount in a grocery store or a business. You would be talking about possession of fentanyl or 1 pill of oxycodone. Those would all be felonies that would fall under this bill. And I think we can all agree it's really important for us to make distinctions. And I think if the point is public safety, which I agree should be the #1 thing we're looking at, we need to make sure that we cast the net, that we are catching those that we feel are a harm to the community, but not taking such a broad stroke that we capture folks that have made a legitimate mistake. They are good people that have made poor choices, and I think we all know that none of us wants to be judged on our very worst day. I do want to say that I am extremely concerned about what this could do to diversion programs and accountability courts. And let me just step back and say this about bonds. I've heard a lot today about there was nothing that would prevent a judge from setting a $25 bond or a $10 bond or even a penny bond. And while that is factually accurate, it does not take into account practicability. And let me just tell you this from my experience in misdemeanor land, just misdemeanor land. Your average bond on a driving with suspended license is going to be about $1,500. Your average bond on a domestic violence case is going to be about $2,500. Your average bond on a high and aggravated misdemeanor is going to be about $5,000. That's misdemeanor land. So the idea that Superior Court judges would set a $5 or a $10 bond on any felony charge far below the standard bond that we see in misdemeanor court is just not practical. So we do have to make sure that we understand that while a judge can, it is not in line with what a judge does in most circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the members of the committee. My name is Jared Williams. I'm the District Attorney for the Augusta Judicial Circuit. That's Richmond and Burke counties. I am here because I have an interest in public safety, just like the members of this committee, and as well as the senator who proposed this bill. I want to point out that when I was in ADA, one of the most serious cases I handled was two gentlemen who had decided to go do a string of armed robberies. And they hit one older lady, they hit one younger child, and then they eventually robbed a young man, shot him in the back, and paralyzed him. And the reason that they went on this crime spree was because they were trying to get up bail money for one of the defendant's brothers. Both those men are in prison. I bring up that story to point out that this issue of bail, of changing this bail statute is going to create issues in a lot of different ways. One is if someone spends 4 days in jail, they're 50% more likely to recidivate. They're 50% more likely to create another victim. We don't want more victims in this state. The reason for that is if you are held in jail for that amount of time, most people are working low-wage, low-security jobs where you don't show up for 4 days, you lose your job. You lose your job, you lose your house. You lose your house, you lose your prospects of personal security, and those conditions lead to more crime. This bill would make it to where if someone is charged with possession of marijuana and they have 28.1 grams instead of 28, now they have to have an actual secured bond. The senator said that this is crime becoming a way of life for people, and I agree with that. But this bill robs the courts of the same weapons and tools that we have to combat making this the way of life for so many defendants, because by having someone on a secured bail and requiring that for those who cannot afford it, we are saying that we will not allow them to enter into accountability courts. We will not allow them to go into pretrial diversion programs, veterans court, mental health court, unless they can pay. And that takes away from us the ability to provide accountability and give them opportunities to get the treatment and services that they need so that this is not a way of life and that we can actually change their lives. And so I respectfully ask that this committee consider that and consider that this bill is more like the axe than the toenail clipper, and that we have a good bill, a good law right now that is narrowly tailored to deal with the crimes that most directly impact community safety, and that we should stand by it. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you. I have one question for you, if you'll. Would you answer a question here, Chairman Powell?
Yes. You know, I'm listening with interest a lot of the arguments, but the current list of the 28 or whatever I've got down of the bail-restricted felonies, do y'all support all of those?
Yes, sir. I do.
I'm speaking for myself. Somebody had said there were 600 others. Quite honestly, I'd like to have a copy of those. I mean, I'd like to see.
We can provide you a copy.
I would like to have a copy of those. But so, do you think that the felony on this bail restricted didn't say anything about fentanyl? I don't believe. But do you think that someone that is in possession of record amount? It doesn't take a lot of fentanyl to kill everybody, kill a lot of folks. Do you think that should be bail restricted?
If we're talking about simple possession, which is what we are talking about, because as you all know, the only drug that can, for simple possession, that can be classified as a misdemeanor is marijuana. So if you are possessing what we call a single-use, personal use amount, you're not distributing drugs, you're not trafficking in drugs, it is presumably a personal amount, which we see in the hands of those with substance abuse disorder, then yes, I do believe that should not be on the bail-restricted list. It shouldn't be based on what your particular drug of choice or your particular drug of necessity in getting if you have a substance abuse disorder problem. We want to get you in accountability court. We want to get you in drug court. We want to get you in diversion. And by limiting this use, we would not be able to get those people into, in a timely fashion, or if ever, in an accountability court or diversion program, which is meant to turn those lives around and get those people back to being law-abiding citizens here in the state of Georgia.
And if I may ask then, on the condition, on whether you talk about the accountability courts, diversion courts, but still, once arrested, bail is the reason that that person comes back to court or to stand court. Do you have any alternative that would assure that, as to how it would work with the, say, a diversion court?
If you are in the program, you're incentivized to complete that program. In some ways, you might be incentivized by having your case dismissed or having your record restricted. That's a whole lot of a reason to come into court and handle your business, go to treatment, deal with your counselors, and you would lose that opportunity. And just to go back to the fentanyl issue, the scary part about fentanyl, what keeps me up at night, is that a lot of people are possessing it unwittingly. They think that they're possessing an oxycodone pill, and in fact, they have something that will kill them. And so we need to direct more people into the types of courts and programs that will change their lives, get them on the right track, reduce the harm that is done by substance use disorder. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. We have a couple of more questions. Chairman Powell. Collins, excuse me.
Oh, Lord have mercy. Thank you.
Hey,
I appreciate that. I'll take that as a compliment.
I know you do.
Well, I don't want to get too far off on the weeds in my question here for you, but refresh my memory. If you're charged with a felony, theft, what's the threshold, the monetary threshold? Is it?
There's no monetary threshold. I can just tell you, practically speaking, what most judges are going to do. For a theft charge, it might be $2,500 or $5,000 as a low-level felony.
Okay. I'm saying as far as if I steal merchandise, so it's got to be up to $2,500 before I'm charged as a felony, or is it?
Oh, you're talking about the threshold for
right.
a felony.
Right.
I can't even. Is it $1,500 now?
For
$500. Yeah.
And so a follow-up question, if I may, please, and while we're talking about this.
There's debate in the room about shoplifting. Versus either way.
That's what happens when you get a lot of lawyers in the room.
Too many,
you have
right?
a lot of debate.
Right.
Yeah,
I don't want
to. Go ahead.
I don't want to belabor this point too much, but does that figure need to come up? I mean, when that figure was put into play, you're talking about years ago, and maybe that figure should raise over a period of time?
Actually, years ago, it was reduced. When I was Solicitor General, that threshold was reduced so that some of those felony charges could be treated as misdemeanors. So I don't think so. Okay. I don't think we need to increase those, because what we were seeing was on those low-level thefts, people facing felony charges, when I think the system indicated that those should be misdemeanors.
Okay. And one more question, if I may, Mr. Chair. That's one of my concerns about the diversion program. About this bill, I have grave concerns about those programs, and I don't know that we need to talk to the author of the bill or who, but I think that there's some opportunity there to improve this piece of legislation to do what we all want to do. If I just want to make that as a comment.
I have one more question from Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your presentations. Good to see you, T.A. Boston. She is my district attorney from DeKalb County, and she does a great job. From your remarks, from both of you, D.A. Williams as well, is this issue of poverty, I think, was central to it, which is that we're going to have, for those that can afford it, they're not going to be incarcerated. For those that cannot afford it, they will be incarcerated. And I remember a Federal Reserve report from a few years ago that roughly said, I may not have the exact numbers correct, but they're close, that 2/3 or so of Americans could not afford a $300 or $400 unexpected bill for like an emergency. And the numbers that you said for bails on misdemeanors are well above that, and certainly felonies would be too. So in terms of, from your experience, what this would do, Do you agree with the proposition that this will lead to the incarceration of far more poor people than are being incarcerated right now for these issues?
Absolutely. I mean, there's just no doubt. I mean, the numbers don't lie. And what you said is that if a bond is $2,500, if you are from an affluent family, you get out. If you are from a poor family or have no means, you don't. And again, we're talking about low-level, non-violent felonies, many of which are property crimes, and where someone wouldn't even have a history, where you'd be seeing those types of bonds where right now this would not apply, and a judge could look at all those circumstances and make the decision that it's not in the best interest for there to be a cash bond associated because this person shows no risk of committing a crime and has shown through the ILA factors that they are going to come back to court to face the charges for which they stand accused.
Yeah, I hear you, and I'll add just one quick anecdote because I think it's easy to get locked in on the types of crimes, but the very first case that I prosecuted when I was an Army JAG officer was a murder case, believe it or not. And it was two roommates who were extraordinarily drunk. There was a presence of a firearm, and one of them wound up killing the other. Initially, it looked like a suicide because it was a close contact wound, but through investigation, it turned out not to be. So I just share that because murder is like the most serious offense, but knowing what I know about that instance, there was no flight risk. There was no danger to anybody else. It was a limited circumstance where a really awful decision was made that led to the loss of life. And so I want to just share that because even in the most terrible situations, you may not need to have an extraordinarily high level of bail to have people show up in court, which is, again, the ultimate purpose. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you. We have one more question for you. Representative Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, you had mentioned about you were talking about the bail amounts for misdemeanors being as high as $1,500, $2,500, and you had said that judges would not be inclined to do the lower $1, $5 amounts of bail. But aren't those same judges doing OR or signature bonds now for these other felonies? So if they're inclined to do an OR or signature bond now, why would they not be inclined to do a very low amount bail if this were to pass?
So I think you're almost making my point, which is, categorically, what is the difference between a 1 cent, $1 or a $5 bond versus an SOR bond? The distinction in there is money. And we have people sitting in our jail that can't rub two nickels together. So I think if we're going to talk about the idea of a judge could set a $5 bond, why are we putting that hurdle in front of people that can't afford it? Why don't we look at the circumstances, the charges, the criminal history, and whether that person will return to court, which a judge does every day in making that determination.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make clear that's what I thought you were trying to say, but it came across differently to me. Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the questions. Thank you very much. I believe we have next, we have Ms. Coco Patty. Did I say that right?
That's all right.
All right.
It's Pappy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Coco Pappy, and I'm the Director of Public Policy at Deep Center, a nonprofit in Savannah, Georgia, that works with both youth and adults in the school district and in the justice system. And I specifically traveled here today from Chatham County to oppose this bill. However you might feel about cash bail and cash bond, this legislation is simply not thought through to the very end. If we want to genuinely take into consideration the multifaceted needs of public safety, we can absolutely do more work to the consideration of what that means. One of the ways Deep Center looks to provide public safety policy solutions is through data. And I am gravely concerned that this piece of legislation is lacking this, including the most glaring question I have, which is how much will it cost? Because I can give you a bird's eye view from Chatham County. In the fall of 2021, Deep Center worked with a data set obtained from our Chatham County Sheriff's Office. This data includes information on people admitted to jail and their charges between July 15th, 2020 and October 1st, 2021, as well as daily census numbers of the jail population by race, gender, and over the same time period. I'm going to ask you to consider the ramifications of this bill if signed through what I am about to present to you. So there are 660 felonies in the state of Georgia, and we know 28 of those are bail restricted, including the new charges that were added by last year's SB 174. In Chatham County, it costs $74.51 per day to house someone in our jail. That means we now have 632 new ways of paying $74.51 per day in a jail that is already understaffed. So from July 15th, 2020 to October 1st, 2021, we had a total of 6,546 bookings in our jail. When about 1,100 of those were impacted charges. So we're looking at ordinances that could be charged at the city or the county level over a state misdemeanor. 5,447 bookings, 83.2% of our jail population, includes misdemeanors and felonies. 4,941 of those charges are not considered bail-restricted offenses, which means about 506 were. So I want to break that down even more. I'm picking 3 categories of felony offenses, which include our 2nd, 3rd, and 6th most felony charges in Chatham County: possession, theft, and probation violation. There are 43 charges we tracked in those 3 categories specifically, and 1,379 unique charges total. 91 of those charges were already considered bail restricted, and the remaining 1,288 are considered non-bail restricted. So if we do what this bill does, which is to make all felonies bail restricted, we will add on an extra 1,288 total at the cost of $74.41 per day, and that is $95,840.00. A typical bond hold in Chatham County is 72 hours, 3 days. This puts us at $287,530.24. These are conservative low estimates. Furthermore, we found that people with multiple jail bookings account for about 21% of our total admissions and 18% of our total bed days. And about half of these bookings are for nonviolent offenses directly related to substance abuse, poverty, and mental illness. That in itself seems to be in direct contradiction with the good bipartisan work of the mental health parity bill. Lastly, Chatham County is doing some tremendous work in spite of our incredible surmounting challenges around public safety in our community. Our sheriff has worked hard to undo unsafe jail crowding, and many of our county have been working for years to try and divert those with mental health and substance abuse from our jail and into much needed treatment, an accomplishment we have been nationally recognized for. We are a stepping up innovator county. Lastly, as mentioned many times before, this bill is going to put a major price tag on diversion programs, putting in jeopardy, again, many of the efforts we see work. We already have a $6.5 million backlog in Chatham County. So what will this bill add to that? And who pays for it? And if this is just what it looks like in Chatham County, what will it look like across the state and in your own districts? So I just urge you strongly to vote no on SB 504. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Do we have any questions for her? Thank you so much again for coming up. I don't see any questions at this time. We have one more speaker to the bill, Ms. Maisie Lynn Gerton. The floor is yours, okay?
Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. Thanks so much for hearing from us today. My name is Maisie Lynn Gerton. I'm General Counsel for the Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. I'm going to do my best not to rehash things that some of my colleagues have mentioned today, but I do think it's worth noting a few things that have come up. I believe as your committee considered the crime issues over the summer and the fall, you heard that crime data, overall crime statistics are down. Murders are up. Ag assaults are up, and I'm looking at the published information on the GBI's website to get to tell you this. And we know that murder and ag assault are already bail restricted offenses under 17.612. We agree with Senator Robertson that jail should not be filled with people charged with misdemeanors. There are misdemeanor bail restricted offenses in 17.612 because of Senate Bill 402, Senator Robertson's initial legislation in this journey of modifying our bond laws. A key way to get people to return to court is adequate notice. During the Criminal Justice Reform Council's years during Governor Deal's administration, there was, and I wish I could remember which county it is. I think it's Pickens County, but I would I would stand to be corrected if someone remembers. They instituted a pilot program where they started doing text reminders for people to come to court, and their return rate went up to 97%. And that was not taking into account whether they had a secured or unsecured bond. It was just whether or not they received additional notice, timely notice, accurate notice, kind of like what Mr. Franklin was saying. When people end up moving or having phones disconnected, when they don't get the notice, that's one of the biggest reasons they don't return to court. In fact, the Pretrial Justice Institute has done some studies that show there is actually no strong correlation. There's not a correlation between whether someone returns to court or whether they recidivate when they're on bond, if they pay a bond or if they're released without a bond. These things do not line up the way that they seem to in our guts, right? We want to say in our gut that if someone puts money on the line, they're going to come back. The numbers do not bear that out. Just like we want to say if someone pays money, they're not going to commit another crime. The numbers just simply don't bear that out. Whether or not someone can afford to pay a bond is not the best indicator of whether they're going to commit another crime or return to court. And as has been mentioned today, I do want to reiterate this point. When you're looking at our bond statutes, it's 1761. There are several factors that the judge has to consider before determining what the bond or bond conditions are going to be. And that is the person that's in the best position to make the assessment of all the circumstances. It's kind of like what Representative Holcomb was saying about his murder case. You never know what the facts of a case are going to be. You never know what someone's home life situation is going to be, or resources and support they could have, if they can access a pretrial diversion program, which under this legislation, people will only access if they can afford to put money down for a bond if they're charged with a felony. Public sentiment supports a move away from using money bail. In a 2018 survey that was jointly sponsored by the Pretrial Justice Institute and the Koch Brothers Institute, 57% of Americans believe people should not be incarcerated solely because they can't afford money bond. In Washington, D.C., they moved away from cash bail in the 1990s. In 2017, the district courts released 94 of their defendants without cash bail. 88% of them showed up to their court dates. In New Orleans, a pilot project in 2018 found that people released without cash bail made it back to court at the same rate as people released with other bond provisions. You've already heard, and the list that was provided to Chairman Powell is straight from the GBI's website. The over 600 felonies that are on our books was pulled from the GBI's website. It's what they publicly publish about the code. Just going to slip through the things that people have covered. I don't want to belabor the point, but we do want to make sure that people who are being considered for bond receive an individualized bond determination. When a person's liberty is in jeopardy, including through pretrial detention, due process principles of the 14th Amendment are implicated, as Senator Robertson mentioned. Substantive due process requires that a governmental infringement on liberty, your ability to hold someone in jail, must be narrowly tailored to serve a compelling state interest. According to our U.S. Supreme Court, jailing a person solely because of their inability to pay or supply a monetary payment for bond violates due process unless the person's ability to pay has been assessed and there's a finding that such non-payment was willful or there was no other means that will serve the government's interests. And we know that there are several other wonderful means that will serve the government's interest in ensuring that people come back to court. You heard it from your elected DAs. We have pretrial diversion programs that have supervision and oversight. We have accountability court programs that have supervision and oversight. And even in Fulton County, as Mr. Franklin was alluding to, when people were receiving the signature bonds that were the genesis of Senate Bill 402 that were such a concern, in some of those cases, in most of those cases, there's a pretrial staff. And I'm sorry, I don't know the term of art of what they call themselves, but it's sort of like being on probation while you're in pretrial. You have to report, they're pretrial officers. You have to report to them on a regular basis, just like you might if you were serving a probation sentence upon conviction. We share the same concerns that the Deep Center does about the cost to taxpayers. I do not have the kind of data that Ms. Pappy has, But we do believe that what she's shared with you should be considered, and we would encourage you to go back and ask your county leaders, your sheriffs, what they thought the day-to-day cost would be if people who are now being released on felony unsecured judicial release bonds were not able to access those anymore. Senate Bill 504 undermines public safety because it does limit access to these pre-adjudication treatment and services programs that we mentioned. And it is important that you all know that there is a tie to House Bill 1013 with the passage of Senate Bill 504. We understand the desire in House Bill 1013 is to expand the care and focus on people with dual diagnoses that come through our criminal legal system. And because of that, we may see, it's hard to say, but we may see an increase of the people who are either eligible for accountability courts or who are more easily categorized as either being suitable for drug court or mental health court. Today there can be some trouble about designating which court, but this dual diagnosis opportunity that's in House Bill 1013 will help ameliorate some of that problem. And if we don't have pre-adjudication unsecured judicial release bonds, it's not exactly clear how people will enter into accountability courts. And there's one other practical matter, and because this practical matter came to our attention, I feel like there probably are others that I'm just unaware of. But let's, for instance, say that you're a judge in Chatham County, and you're faced with a person who's being charged with forgery, felony forgery. But that same individual has an open case in the neighboring circuit for something more serious, aggravated assault, or we could even go as far as saying murder. One mechanism that's often used to facilitate the transport of that individual from that first county where they have the lower level offense to the county where they have the higher level offense is an unsecured judicial release, because you can't just release them. There could be a production order. There are mechanisms like production orders that could facilitate their transfer back and forth, but a lot of times the lower level county wants to just get the person out of their system, off of their dime, and into the county where they've allegedly committed the more serious crime so that they can handle the case. And a lot of times what happens is both cases get handled in tandem, but you're dealing with the more severe case. So there are these practical ways that unsecured judicial release is used also to facilitate the movement of criminal cases that I think are just collateral consequences that people weren't thinking about, you know, during the course of this particular piece of legislation that would need to be considered if we're going to move forward on this kind of restrictive bond practice. And I would stand for any questions you have if you have any left after all of us talking to you today.
Don't see any at this time. Thank you so much, Ms. Gerton, for being here. Thank you. I think what we'll do right here at the end, we'll let Senator Robertson close us out here briefly, and the floor is yours.
I'll be extremely brief. I think I appreciate everyone that came up and spoke, and appreciate the passion that they had. Heard a lot about bond hearings. This doesn't impact a bond hearing at all. Bond hearings are established. If you go into any county jail in the state of Georgia, you're going to find what they call a bond menu posted, where judges, Superior Court judges in most cases, have pre-established bonds for different offenses. That way you don't have to call a judge on the weekends or other late hours and try to find out what the bond is for violation of Georgia Controlled Substance Act, Schedule 1, 2, or there are many others that fall under those subcategories. Those bonds are already established. And Superior Court judges can continue to do that. They can establish menus for whatever charges there might be. I'm the proud architect of the Veterans Court, Mental Health Court, and Drug Court in Muskogee County in the Chattahoochee Judicial Circuit, and we've had great success with that, especially being the home of Fort Benning, where we had the opportunity to run into many veterans who got out and had issues transitioning back into the community, and if they got themselves in trouble, we were able to help them get reestablished by if they went out and violated some law, whether it be a felony or a misdemeanor, we were able to get them over into the Veterans Court. And I do agree with them. We have a good law right now. I think what we did a couple of years ago went a long way in establishing public safety, strengthening public safety. A lot of the numbers and everything they've got to talk about, the individuals we're talking about in many cases, we're not going to have established the necessarily motive for their crime by the time the individual comes into jail and gets out of jail. We're not going to know if it's substance abuse disorder, if it's poverty, or a lot of other things. And, you know, the vast majority of misdemeanors do not involve legitimate public safety concerns, with the exception of DUI and things of that nature, where someone abusing a substance might get on the road and put other Georgians in danger. So therefore, I do believe that jails should not be full of misdemeanors, if you will. Now, as far as public opinion goes, the polls that I read, and we all read different polls. I've read some that were mentioned here today, and others I've read are from Georgians who want us to be tougher, who want us to protect them more because they don't feel safe. And when someone steps up, and the Atlanta police chief stepped up in a meeting and said, I'm glad to say that crime is down in Atlanta. And when I asked him to pull burglaries out of that number, crime was up in Atlanta. And the reason burglaries were down, and as my friend on this committee who did the job I did understands completely, most burglaries occur during the day. If you're in a city where the city has been shut down, people are not going to go into homes where they know people are and burglarize those homes. That's the reason for crime rates going down over the past couple of years in Atlanta, if you look at the overall crime rates, because individuals were not able to go into homes during the day and steal things. And while I appreciate the expertise of all those who testified, I did not hear one mention, a single mention of a crime victim. I did not hear one person. I can hear them now, but standing at the podium, I did not hear one person show any compassion or concern for the citizens of this state, the poor, the middle class, and the wealthy, who work every day and want to live in a safe community and raise their family in a safe community and send their children to schools in a safe community. And we as legislators are in a unique position where we can not only ensure that those convicted of crimes, those arrested for crimes, those accused of crimes are protected through a system of due process that is clearly established by the Constitution of the United States of America, but we also have the responsibility of protecting that single mom right now, like my mother was, who's getting up and going to work her second job today, that her car's not stolen, that she's not assaulted, and all we have to do is pick up the paper here in this city. A lady was killed over a bowling ball. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your time.
Very well said. I appreciate that very much. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming and being here today. I thought we had a good discussion about this. I'm sure we're going to hear more about it. So at this time, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.